Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm actually here in my office in Kuala Lumpur, speaking to you all remotely. Um, for most, I know that you have all met me before. I know there's some new faces here as well. My name is Manuel Sanchez. I'm the regional director for the U.S. Grains Council in Southeast Asia, and it's a great honor to be with you with you all this morning. I know that the situation with the current pandemic, it's made it difficult for us to meet in person. But I'm really pleased and happy that we have these technologies that allow us to connect. I hope that my video, my presentation today finds you all in good health and safety. And as always, these are just a presentation. You could always feel free to reach out to me directly here at the U.S. Grains Council in Southeast Asia. And I have my link at the end of the presentation. But today, I bring you the update, a great update on the U.S. corn crop and the DDGs outlook. We're going to be talking about the overall supply and demand outlook for U.S. corn and for the global corn as well. And we'll also hone in and talk about U.S. co-product, more specifically U.S. DDGs, and talk about the market dynamics that might be affecting pricing and also shipments of U.S. DDGs into the region. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So from an overall global production and export outlook, we're really focusing primarily on the U.S. as the largest producer of corn. The corn crop, the growing season has kicked off. So far, we've had great conditions, so we'll cover a little bit of what's going on there. We're seeing South America as well, also having some great crop projections. Brazil in particular is slotted to have a record corn production. USDA might be a little high in these productions in terms of their overall numbers that they're projecting. The trade is a bit more conservative, but we'll cover what's happening in Brazil. In Argentina, we're seeing very aggressive and competitive pricing for corn overall, but we are seeing issues with loading, typical for Argentina. Year over year, we did notice that they are 50% lower in terms of exports compared to where we would be at this point in the year. So, there's something to be followed there. The Black Sea region, it's projected to have a record corn and export program this year. So we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the Ukraine, and then China as well. China is always China. They've been buying significant amounts of corn so far this marketing year, but they also have a TRQ, so that is limited. We'll talk a little bit about China as well. So moving right along, if we look at the global picture, we stand back from a global PS&D for corn specifically. We could see in red here, the red line, where we highlight world production. Now, these are USDA May figures, and this is where all my numbers are being quoted from, the USDA May figure report. But global production, it's set at a new high, a new global high at 1.87 billion metric tons of corn, with consumption pegged at 1.162 billion metric tons. Obviously, we're seeing record amount of corn being produced not only in the US, but also in countries like Brazil, the Ukraine, Mexico, and Canada. And that's really the main driver as to see why we're seeing such a high increase in overall corn production. This is about an 8% increase year over year compared to what we saw in 2019. And similarly, consumption, we're seeing a 4% increase compared to what we saw last year. Now, you would wonder, given the current COVID situation, the global pandemic, these figures might seem a little high. The USDA and the belief in the market is that because prices are so competitive, that there will be consumption. There'll be an increase in consumption. So that's highlighting both production and consumption estimates. If we look at ending stocks, and that's really the big game changer. Global ending stocks are pegged at 340 million metric ton, of which 84 million are in the US in particular. Now we got to go back more than 35 years to see such a high ending stock value for the US. So this is quite high, and this is something that the trade is following and following closely. Another thing to mention, that out of the 340 million metric tons of ending stocks, we got to take into account that around 200 of that is sitting in China. China has begun to significantly reduce their corn ending stocks, but they're still right at the 200 million metric ton mark. So we'll see what happens moving forward. If we hone into the main corn producers around the globe, we're honing in primarily to the U.S. The U.S. is slotted to have a record crop, 406 million metric tons this year. A lot of people say that that's a higher number. They don't expect this to materialize, but we're still very early on in the growing season. Our farmers are just about to complete harvest, so we'll see what happens there. China, from a production level, really staying steady at 260 million metric tons. And then once you get into some of the third and fourth markets, a market like Brazil, that's projected to have a corn production of 106 million metric tons. Now this is a record number for them. A lot of people are saying that they don't physically believe this number. They're saying that it's a bit on the high side. There has been pressure in Brazil, specifically in their southern growing region, because of dry conditions. Some experts are pegging Brazil's crop this year to be more closer to 100 million metric tons, 101 rather than 106. But we'll follow that. The EU with 68 million metric tons, Argentina with 50. But really another game changer has been Ukraine. Ukraine's crop is pegged at 39 million metric tons. This would be a record crop with a record yield out of the Ukraine. And it's incredible to see Ukraine really come up and hit the high mark that they're going to be, or they're projected to hit this year. If we look back just 8 years ago, Ukraine's production was below 20 million metric tons, right? To see them double that amount in little over 5 years is quite significant, and something that we're all following closely. Now, we talked about corn producers, main producers around the globe, but not all producers are exporters. If we hone in and look at main exporters around the world, corn exporters, we look at the U.S. with a projected export program of 55 million metric tons, followed by Brazil with 38 million, Argentina with 34 million, and then the Ukraine with 33 million. Now, if you reference the previous page and you saw the record production out of the Ukraine with 39 million, they export the bulk of their corn. So this is significantly, as you could see, the last 3 consecutive years, they've been increasing their export program. So that's something that we're following very closely. Argentina as well, we expect, given what's happening with their currency, we expect them to have a strong export as soon as the water levels stabilize in their ports and they're able to ship all that corn. Most of their corn has been sold, but what they're having difficulties is with shipping that specific corn. Similar to Brazil, we're seeing a record amount of sales out of Brazil, specifically because of the devaluation of their currency. And we foresee if their currency stays weaker, we foresee that they are going to be planting more corn. So we could see more Brazilian corn to come in the future if things stay the same that they are today. From a corn importing perspective, we talked about the supply side, but on the demand side, if we look at the top corn importers around the globe, we have Mexico leading the way with 18.3 million metric tons, followed by Japan with 16, and Korea with close to 12 million metric tons. Then you have your Vietnams, Egypt, Iran. China has really been one to follow right there in the middle of the screen. If you've seen over the last 6 years, we've seen a significant increase in their overall corn importation. And we believe that this year they're going to max that TRQ up right at 7 million metric tons. China also is beginning to plant, and they're starting their growing season. So we're following China very closely. There's a lot that could happen between here and the fall. So this is a number that we're tracking. We could see the possibility of something happening in China and them importing more corn, or more feed stuff in general, more corn substitutes to really backfill their starch need domestically. Colombia's import projections are pegged at 6.5 million metric tons. Then you have Algeria, Taiwan, so on and so forth, ending with Malaysia here, as I've given you the top 14 markets and their projected corn imports. If we take a sort of a regional view, and this, I put this slide here because it allows us to put things into perspective. If you take more of a regional view and you look at corn imports in the last 12 months, so I'm reporting here from June of 2019 right until May of 2020. You see that we definitely seen a peak right around September. These are global corn imports, so from all origins around the globe. We've seen a peak in September of 2019 right at about 12.5 million metric tons of monthly corn imports. That decreased. Obviously, we know that the COVID pandemic has affected us all around the globe, and we've really seen sort of the valley hit right around February, March. But as a sign of what I put it, hope, we've seen that the demand has been on the rise. It is trending up. In the month of May, we saw over 11.5 million metric tons of corn being imported globally. Seeing strong demands out of the northern ASEAN countries, Northern Asia, countries like Japan, Korea, Taiwan. In addition to that, we also see stronger demand out of countries like Southeast Asia. We're seeing a lot of corn coming into places like Vietnam, recent shipments into the Philippines. In addition, also corn going into Indonesia for the industrial production purposes. So corn is still flowing into this market. I'm going to go and talk a little bit about the U.S. crop. So I've given you a sort of a global purview of what's happening in the markets. We're going to hone in and talk about the U.S. crop in particular. So honing in and talking about the U.S. crop, these figures were published by the USDA in early May. This is the first initial estimates. We are just kicking off our 2020-2021 corn crop. There's a lot of dynamics. There's a lot of questioning given where we're at today. So I'm going to try to do my best to cover some of the concerns and some of what the market is talking about as it relates to the U.S. crop. So from a corn planting perspective, as of May 24th, the U.S. is 88% planted, and this number is quite high. Yeah, you got to go back, and we haven't had a start like this in about 5 years. So it's great to see that the weather is cooperating primarily, and that our farmers are being able to go out and plant their crop. If you compare to last year, and last year, as you might remember, last year was a difficult year. It was very wet across most of the corn belt. It was very difficult for farmers to get out there and plant their corn. Last year, at this same time frame, 56% of the corn crop was planted. So we're exceeding the pace that we saw last year from a planting perspective, and the overall 5-year average at this point should be 82%. So we're exceeding that as well. And I highlight state by state here. I highlighting the 18 states that 91% of the total U.S. corn crop is grown and they're sown in. As you can see, states like Texas and Missouri, Tennessee, Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, almost completed with their planting. Typically, the middle of April is when you see, on average, most of the U.S. farmers going out to plant their corn. So by the end of May, beginning of June, that corn crop, from a planting perspective, is being wrapped up. If you look at corn emerged, and this is really the sprouting and the physical corn plant emerging from the ground. As of May 24th, 64% of the corn crop had emerged. And this is a significantly higher figure, specifically if you're comparing it to last year's crop where we had some difficulties, or even the 5-year average at 58%, we're exceeding that as well. So, we're getting off to a great growing season, a great start here in the U.S. From a condition perspective, the USDA has reported that 70% of the U.S. corn crop right now is good to excellent conditions. So we're monitoring this on a weekly basis. And so far, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a great crop to begin with. If we hone into the actual production, we're seeing U.S. corn productions are pegged at 406 million metric tons, with domestic use at 321, exports pegged at 55, and ending stocks are at 84 million tons. This is quite a high figure on the ending stocks. You got to go back at least 33 years to see such a high figure on the ending stocks, but also stocks to use are pretty high as well. If we look at specifically to how the consumption is being projected from a food, seed, and non-ethanol industrial use, consumption in the U.S. is pegged at 36 million. Ethanol production is pegged at 132 million from an overall corn consumption going into ethanol. And then feed and residuals at 154 million. There was a lot of sort of chatter in the markets regarding this 131 million metric tons of corn going out into the ethanol side. We believed earlier on, given the COVID pandemic, that this would have been hard to attain. But given what's happening and with the opening of the U.S. market, we're seeing week over week of ethanol stocks being reduced. So as Americans go out and start driving more, we believe that this should be attainable. From an overall snapshot for the month of May, planted areas in terms of acreages or hectares are projected at 39.3. This is significantly high. We're expecting that there is going to be some areas where there's issues, and the farmers today are incentivized. They receive payments given the current situation that's happening. So we don't believe that the planted area is going to be as high as what the USDA has projected it to be. So we're expect to see reduction here, specifically around the overall harvested area once the corn's harvested. Record yield at 11.2 metric tons per hectare, and everything as of right now indicates that we're on track to hit those yields. Production, as I mentioned, pegged at 406 million metric tons. Exports at roughly 55 million, and with consumption at 154 for feed, and then ethanol at 132, so on and so forth. So, the biggest change here, I think, to project is physical harvested areas, because these figures, seemed a little higher. There are notions specifically in states like Ohio and in North Dakota where we are seeing some issues with the planting, as well as in the South, we're seeing more corn acreage and wheat also battling in some areas as well. So that's something to follow. I want to hone in and briefly talk about the ethanol markets. It goes without saying, it's been a tough last 90 days for our ethanol producers. Obviously, with the oil markets and really the decline that we saw overall, it's really put a burden on our ethanol industry. But as I mentioned earlier, we're beginning to see a rebound from the lows that we saw, in February, in March specifically, and then it really bottomed out in April. Roughly 70 ethanol plants remain offline today, out of slightly over 200 ethanol plants. It's a significant amount. Close to 50% had to shut down completely their operations. But we're beginning to see a rebound from the low levels that we saw in April. Ethanol production is coming back online. DDGs prices have also stabilized, and we're beginning to see the pre-COVID or right around the beginning January price points that we're accustomed to seeing. As of May 22nd, We saw 5 consecutive weeks of increased ethanol production in the US, which is a good sign. 68% of the total production capacity is back today. So we don't foresee any issues from an overall DDGS supply. As most of you are aware, DDGS is a byproduct of the ethanol industry, which is why we're following the ethanol industry very closely. If we look at Southeast Asia overall, and we look at DDGS, we cannot talk about DDGS without talking about containers. This market here in Southeast Asia is primarily a containerized market. Most of the U.S. ag commodity that shipped to this part of the globe comes in container. There are a lot of bulk, but a lot of it is in container, specifically when you look at co-products. 9% of all our waterborne agricultural exports are shipped in container versus 91% in bulk. And to this market in particular, that's the lion's share of our agricultural exports as it relates to co-product. If we look at total containerized exports in 2018, we see countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, Thailand high up there in terms of overall market share from a U.S. perspective. 13% of all our ag exports were shipped via container into Vietnam. 18% were shipped via container into Indonesia. So this is why it's important to talk about what's happening in the container market, given that the freight component is a crucial component of the pricing. If we go back, and it wasn't really until right after Chinese New Year, so at the end of February, we started to see delays with the containers, where it was taking 30 to 45 days to get secure space and get bookings. You started to see steamship line right at the beginning of March beginning to void sailings. One in particular steamship line that comes to mind is Maersk, that voided over 90 sailings, or nearly 10% of their overall fleet right at the beginning of March. And that's obviously due to the pandemic and what was happening. In the U.S., we typically bring in these containers full of iPhones, more of the consumer goods, and these containers need to come back with something, and they typically come back with U.S. agricultural products. So you saw some delays and voiding of sailings overall. You started to see an overall capacity issue with limited availability of containers in the U.S. right at the end of March. And things weren't necessarily looking very promising. Things today are beginning to rebound, and we're beginning to see more stability in the container markets. Even prices have began to adjust. So we believe that the market is resuming back to its normal course, but we'll need to see what the end of June brings. From an overall export perspective, if we look at US DDGS, and I wanted to put this in here, I know there's a lot of figures in here, but if we look at Q1, the first 3 months of the year, January, February, and March, we see overall DDGS numbers still fairly strong. Things are not as bad as some might put it. From an overall exports, Vietnam has taken our coveted number 2 spots. In the first 3 months of the year, they imported over 250 million metric tons of DDGS, culminating even with 3 bulk vessels that really were able to position themselves into Vietnam. Another market that we see a significant increase as well is Indonesia. Fairly strong numbers for the first 3 months of the year with over 320,000 metric tons of DDGS. Some other notable markets in the region are Thailand, but really one that I'd like to bring to your attention is New Zealand and Australia. We're seeing records amounts of DDGS going into Australia in particular, as they recently began to import DDGS for the first time. So this is something that we're following closely, and we hope that the trend continues. From an overall commodity prices, I've talked about the supply and demand, the U.S. growing conditions, what's happening not only in the U.S. but around the globe. So I'm going to hone in and spend the last 3 minutes just briefly giving you some insights on pricing. From a bullish perspective, we believe that there's still a lot to happen from here to potentially mid-July, specifically as it relates to corn. Typically, the middle of July is a pivotal point where we get an understanding as to what's really happening with the U.S. crop. So there are places that are having incredible, perfect growing conditions, but there are also places in the U.S. that the weather hasn't necessarily been cooperating. I mentioned Ohio and also North Dakota specifically. So that's something to keep in mind as we continue through the growing season for corn. Also, prevent planting. There's a lot of chatter in the market about the possibility of acreage for prevent planting being higher this year than what was being reported in March. So that's something that we're following. Ethanol plants are beginning to resume operation. We're not at 100% yet. We're hovering right at that 60 to 70% mark of our overall total capacity. There are some plants that are not going to come into production. We believe that this downfall overall has caused some of the ethanol players to shut down their operation, but there's still plenty of supplies, specifically of DDGs. The U.S. farmers are a bit hesitant on selling, especially at these lower pricing. So that's something to follow as we move forward as well. From a bearish perspective, this is looking to be a record crop, and there's you can't avoid that. 406 million metric tons. It's a whopping corn crop. Even if we come at 400 million metric tons, it's still a record crop for the U.S. So those are still very bearish indicators. And then you have the China tension. Although China's been buying, that's something to keep a close eye on. From a trading range for corn, we're looking at July futures right between the 3 to 350 mark. Really is what the indicators are telling us. And then I have some FOB pricing here, looking at values overall. Argentina being the most competitive at the moment. The U.S. was very competitive right until about a week ago, specifically out of the PNW, but Argentina is really taking up the most competitive FOB offers at the moment. And then I go into our weekly commodity prices, and we publish this on a weekly basis. And so if you don't receive our weekly report, please feel free to reach out to me so I can make sure to put you on copy of that. Corn gluten meal, very competitive out of the U.S. 515 FOB landed into Southeast Asia. You're looking at about 560. And then obviously DDGs, we're beginning to see DDGs pricing stabilize to the pre-pandemic pricing. And we're really seeing landed into the region, right, trading at about 220 to 230 per metric ton. And last but not least, I wanted to talk about our corn export quality report. This is the 9th year that we, the U.S. Grains Council, have put together this report, really to showcase the value of U.S. corn. Feel free to click on the link here, and you'll be able to download our report. And with that, I conclude my presentation to you all this morning. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you, and I look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thank you.